estamos pagando con nuestra vida, estamos pagando con nuestra cultura, estamos pagando con el peligro de extinguirnos.
Desde el 2014 tuve orden de allanamiento, órdenes de captura, fueron allanadas mis casas. He estado retenida en varios momentos por quererme callar, que no siga defendiendo los derechos de los campesinos.
We were being picked up, or women were being dragged and taken out of their houses, showing to all other people that if you resist, this is what will happen.
Es capaz de todo, de lo que sea. Así como le han matado los animales a uno, así también pueden enterrar a uno por ahí en cualquier momento.
Está pidiendo otra cosa más que le respeten sus derechos.
Y no me da miedo ni este maltrato de la mina lo estamos viviendo.
We cannot just sit down. That is the reason why we stand up and raise our voice.
Que defendemos nuestra vida y defendemos este pedacito de tierra que nos daba de qué comer.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us and watching that powerful video of the plight faced by land and environmental defenders around the world. I'm Rachel Owens and I'm the head of Global Witness's EU office, joining you from Brussels. In case you don't know us, Global Witness is an international NGO that campaigns to challenge abuses of power, protects human rights, and secures the future of our planet. A couple of housekeeping points before we get started. We have interpretation in English and Portuguese, and we have set up the meeting to keep it, set up the event as a meeting to keep it more participatory. So please do keep your microphones and videos muted at all times.
6 months after the end of the support.
Please keep your Zoom in speaker mode in order to keep focus on who's speaking. And if you'd like to use interpretation, please click to the interpretation button that's at the right-hand bottom of the Zoom screen. I'd suggest that if you're listening in English, you already click to the English channel so that when our Brazilian speaker comes on, you're all set to hear the translation. So we've just seen a video which represents the very worst extremes of what environmental defenders face trying to protect our planet. We're here today to discuss how the EU can ensure companies respect the planet and those that protect it. In July, Global Witness released its annual report on land and environmental defenders called Defending Tomorrow. We found that 2019 had been the deadliest year on record, with at least 212 activists murdered. Many more faced other threats, including criminalization, loss of livelihood, and harassment. Our report showed the crucial role that defenders play in stopping the climate crisis and showed how irresponsible business is one of the key factors driving the attacks globally. Brazil has consistently been one of the worst affected countries in terms of violence against defenders, and the operating environment for activism has worsened under the current president, Jair Bolsonaro. We will hear from Jefferson, a Brazilian activist, about the struggle in the Teles Pires project. This case is emblematic of the range of threats facing defenders in the country. It shows the importance of European diplomatic support for those at risk and the need for European legislation that would hold European companies, such as the French group, in this dam project to account. Today, we want to discuss how the EU can better protect defenders through new rules for corporations. In April this year, the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, announced that he will introduce new EU rules on corporate accountability and due diligence in early 2021. And yesterday, the European Commission launched its public consultation on these rules, stating that they are crucial to achieving the EU's Green Deal and delivering on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As a reminder, the EU Green Deal, announced in December last year, sets out to ensure that companies properly embed sustainability risks throughout their operations. This is particularly important as we know that many companies still focus too much on short-term financial gain rather than preventing harms to people and planet. In response to this announcement by the Commission, MEPs have started to develop a European Parliament position on what a law on corporate due diligence looks like. The work in the European Parliament's Legal Affairs Committee has begun with the publication of a draft report, which we'll hear more about during this discussion. In the European Council, meanwhile, the German presidency is aiming for Council conclusions in December on business and human rights, including due diligence. So the next few months and years will be crucial to ensuring that the EU can take a strong stand to ensure corporates are held to account for their impacts on people and planet. Today, we have a brilliant panel to discuss this. Joining us from the European Parliament is Lara Walters, who is the MEP leading the work within the Legal Affairs Committee to develop the Parliament's position on EU corporate accountability. We're also joined by Brazilian activist Jefferson Nascimento, whose community has been protesting against the devastating impacts of a huge hydropower project in Amazon rainforest. Germany is currently holding the EU presidency, and we're very pleased to be joined today by two representatives from the German presidency, Johannes Kleine-Benn from the German Ministry of Employment and Social Affairs, who is chairing the Working Party on Social Questions and is a technical lead in the Council working on this issue. We also have Carmen Esser, co-chair of the Working Party on Development Cooperation from the German Ministry for Economic Development and Cooperation. And from Global Witness, my colleague Ben Leather, who is a senior campaigner in our Land and Defenders team, is joining us. I'd like to welcome all today's speakers and thank them very much for taking part in today's event. We'll be running the event as a discussion with the participants firstly looking at the problem and then addressing some of the solutions. We've already collected questions in advance, so thank you to all of the audience members who have already submitted questions. Some of those questions will be addressed in the second part of the event, and any questions we're not able to answer due to time constraints, we will answer in a follow-up blog on our website, globalwitness.org. So please do check that out. We're also aiming to publish a video of today's event on YouTube in the coming weeks. So if you want to follow us also on Twitter, please do. Our Twitter handle is @global_witness and use the hashtags environmental defenders, all one word, and corporate accountability, all one word. So let's kick off the event, and we're going to discuss now what are some of the problems facing environmental defenders. So I'll attend to my colleague Ben first of all. Global Witness has just published a report in July called Defending Tomorrow. What are its key findings?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So our report, Defending Tomorrow, showed that last year was the deadliest year on record for land and environmental defenders, with at least 212 activists killed just for standing up for their rights and our planet. Now, some of these land and environmental defenders worked for NGOs, others were lawyers or journalists, but many were often just community members who'd seen their land snatched or their rivers contaminated and had decided to take a stand. Their activism put them on a collision course with powerful interests, often business interests. So almost a quarter of those murdered last year had protested mining projects. 34 of those killed had spoken out about agribusiness, and others had spoken out about hydropower or illegal logging. A huge proportion of last year's violence was focused in Colombia and the Philippines, though Brazil, Honduras, and Nicaragua are still some of the most dangerous places to protest. Indigenous people represent 40% of those killed, but only 5% of the world's population. However, it's really important to underline that the statistics in our data undoubtedly represent only the tip of the iceberg for two reasons. Firstly, our data on killings is likely to be an underestimate. Many murders go unreported, and in many countries there simply isn't the civic space needed to get information out. And secondly, the killings are only the sharpest end of the threat. UN agencies have shown a range of tactics are used to silence defenders, including death threats against them, against their children, smear campaigns, and imprisonment. Now, beyond the obvious human tragedy, our findings should concern European citizens, businesses, and policymakers for at least two additional reasons. Firstly, these brave people are on the front line of the fight against climate change, challenging those destroying virgin forests and protecting biodiversity. At Global Witness, we've shown that at least 4 land and environmental defenders have been murdered every week since the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. So the question is, how can we hope to protect the planet if we can't protect those who defend it? The second reason is because we know that in some cases, the defenders attacked have been protesting business projects implemented by companies either headquartered in Europe, selling to Europe, or financed from Europe. For example, the inspirational environmentalist Berta Cáceres reported 33 death threats before she was murdered in 2016. European investors only withdrew from the hydro company she opposed more than a year after her killing. In Colombia, indigenous leader Jacqueline Romero has faced repeated death threats after speaking out about displacements caused by the Cerrejón coal mine, owned by companies listed in Europe. The fact that these attacks against activists are rising globally shows that current voluntary guidelines and standards have failed to achieve a meaningful change in corporate behavior. These defenders could be allies in sustainable development, but they're being locked up and killed. So without a doubt, the time's come for strong EU legislation on corporate accountability. We really welcome the work that's being done in all 3 EU institutions, and for the sake of those on the front lines of this climate crisis, we hope the momentum builds and results in meaningful, enforceable legislation.
Many thanks, Ben, for talking through some of the problems faced by defenders. So we know that the everyday reality of fighting for change is tough in a whole range of ways. Now we're going to hear from Jefferson Nascimento, who is based in the Amazon. So please do make sure that your interpretation is put to English so you can hear from Jefferson. So Jefferson, you belong to a movement that struggles for the protection of land, the environment, and rights of communities affected. Sorry, there's a problem with the interpretation. It's coming out of the wrong.
Switch channels with
we just need to switch channels, Sandra,
We're coming out of the English
for our interpreter. So if we I'll just try that question again. The joys of online events. So Jefferson, you belong to a movement that struggles for the protection of land, the environment, and the rights of communities affected by large-scale companies. What has happened that has compelled your community and the movement that you are part of to take a stand and protest? Thank you.
Boa tarde a todos e todas. Agradecer o convite da Global Witness para estar fazendo parte desse evento. Também agradecer a todos e todas que ajudaram a construir esse evento, tanto na Europa quanto aqui no Brasil, e os demais participantes. Eu sou Jefferson, falo aqui de Sinop, Mato Grosso, Brasil, aqui na bacia do rio Telespires, né? O MAB é um movimento dos atingidos por barragem que trabalha há mais de 30 anos em defesa das famílias e comunidades atingidas e também do meio ambiente. E aqui na região nós atuamos há cerca de 10 anos com o início da construção das primeiras hidrelétricas. Foram construídas 4 grandes hidrelétricas aqui no rio Telespires, onde deixou um rastro de imensas violações e crimes ambientais, o que transformou o rio Telespires hoje no rio mais impactado por hidrelétricas na Amazônia. E aí cabe um destaque dentro dessas 4 grandes hidrelétricas, uma em particular, que é a hidrelétrica Sinop, uma hidrelétrica de propriedade de um consórcio chamado SES Sinop Energia, Companhia Energética Sinop, que é formada por um consórcio de 3 empresas. 2 empresas estatais, a Eletronorte e a Chesf, que tem 49% das ações, e uma empresa europeia, a EDF, francesa, que tem 51% dessas ações, ou seja, a empresa majoritária dentro desse consórcio. E o que nos levou a se manifestar, as mobilizações, os protestos, foi as diversas violações de direitos sofridas pelas comunidades diretamente atingidas, ou seja, as famílias tiveram um impacto imenso em suas vidas. Ou seja, foi uma série de descumprimentos que essas empresas causaram durante esses anos todos, em relação principalmente às indenizações dessas famílias, ou seja, eu estou falando aqui de indenizações das terras, das casas e das benfeitorias. O tratamento dado a essas famílias atingidas foi bastante perverso, ou seja, houve um processo de coação e de intimidação muito grande a essas famílias, que as obrigaram a aceitar uma única proposta dessa empresa. Essas famílias tiveram apenas 5 dias para decidir se aceitavam ou não a proposta dessa empresa. Vocês imaginam o que é em 5 dias você aceitar uma proposta que vai mudar toda a sua vida pela frente? E essa proposta, em relação às indenizações das terras dessas famílias, uma perícia judicial recente agora demonstrou que a empresa pagou 7 vezes abaixo daquilo que vale, de fato, as terras, ou seja, bem abaixo do valor de mercado. E, além disso, a comunidade foi totalmente impactada, ou seja, as estradas, a perca da renda, as áreas de lazer, as áreas de pesca, problemas na saúde devido ao enchimento do lago e a infestação de mosquitos que teve principalmente nos primeiros anos, isso teve uma piora muito grande na vida dessas famílias. E um outro destaque que gostaria de fazer foi o tamanho do crime ambiental que se foi cometido aqui. Aqui se alagou cerca de 25 mil hectares de floresta, né? Isso é equivalente a 35 mil campos de futebol. E desses 25 mil hectares de floresta, 15 mil hectares ficaram dentro do lago, ou seja, essa vegetação está morta nesse exato momento dentro do lago, apodrecendo e gerando imensos impactos ambientais, entre eles a mortandade recorrente de vários peixes. Inclusive chegou à soma de 40 toneladas de peixes. Ou seja, além disso, toda a produção de gás metano, né, esses gases, né, de efeito estufa, né, que tem gerado uma série de impactos. Ou seja, é uma energia completamente suja e poluidora. Ou seja, um empreendimento que realmente viola direitos e que destrói o meio ambiente.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jefferson, for talking through the problems that you've been facing in your community. Jefferson mentioned this project, Teles Pires, which EDF is a part owner, and we have actually reached out to the company for comment. We've not yet heard back, but we will post any response from the company on our website, globalwitness.org. So moving on to you, Lara, Jefferson paints a pretty bleak picture of European business potentially profiting from environmental destruction and human rights abuses. How is this being allowed to happen, and what can the EU do to be part of the solution?
How it's been allowed to happen, I think, is the million-dollar question in a way, or at least how we as citizens in the world have allowed this to happen. I think one of the answers is it's happened because those in power have so far favored competition over well-being, and those in power have so far favored competition over sustainability, and unfortunately they've gotten away with it. I guess another part of the answer to that question is that often for European businesses, it's sort of out of mind, or out of sight, out of mind. you know, the things that happen far away, and to people who are less able to defend themselves, you know, are easier to forget about. So I don't want to go into that question too much because I think it's a little bit of a depressing history. But maybe if we focus on the more positive part of this, what can the EU do to be part of the solution? I think we at the moment there's no competitive advantage yet to doing the right thing, and I think at the moment it's the opposite, and that needs to change. But what is changing is voluntary standards are gaining more and more prominence. Sustainability requirements in trade agreements, for instance, are more and more in the spotlight. Investors and financial institutions are making the case more and more often about the importance of ESG investment. And I think that all of that together means momentum is emerging for responsible business conduct. And so maybe to answer the question on how we can be part of the solution as the EU, well, by taking that momentum and by leading it. And for me, of course, that means by introducing due diligence legislation. The time for that is now. There's different parts to the answers, also by as the EU committing to different trade agreements, by being best in class on financial standards or standards for financial institutions and investors. But in principle, I think we're in pole position to do that, given that momentum. But to do that, we need to not be shy about our values. We need to use the leverage of the internal market. And I think we need to trust in the Brussels effect outside of Europe as well.
Great, thanks so much, Lara. And I think that's such an important point, as in the global precedent that action in the EU could mean. So I'll move on to Johannes. Germany is currently holding the presidency of the European Council. What is your vision of what's going wrong, and what is the aim of the German presidency to addressing these problems?
Dear Rachel, dear team from Global Witnesses, yes, so thank you very much first for this very relevant event you are hosting here today, and really for giving the Council the chance to introduce you into our objectives as presidency. Carmen will later speak on behalf of the Working Party of Development Cooperation, CODEF, and I will now speak on behalf of the Social Questions Working Party. We are both representing the overarching approach of the Council presidency on decent work and human rights and global supply chain. As already said by my previous speakers, we are currently all facing a difficult situation concerning human rights. Human rights and social justice have always been at the very core of the European idea. The European Union is based on these principles and has always been. But we have to keep up with the times, and times really have changed the cards on us. For the last 2 decades, globalization and digitalization have changed the world of work on a global scale. Supply chains have become global. A single car can today be built with iron from Russia, cobalt from Africa, and rare earths from China, and assembled in Europe. This is globalization at work. Our clothing comes from factories in Bangladesh, where workers are paid less for a monthly salary than each of us are making most of us are making in the time we are sitting here together. The minimum wage for textile workers in Bangladesh is less than 100 euros per month. Our designer jeans cost more than the woman who has put it together earns in a month. Fundamental rights at work are being violated on a global scale. Millions suffer from poor working conditions and insufficient health and safety provisions. These problems have to be tackled in Europe and on a global scale. And we believe that it is our responsibility to do so. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the problem. It shows us today how important decent supply chains are. Millions of the most vulnerable worldwide, millions of the most vulnerable workers worldwide have lost their jobs and their livelihoods during the pandemic. Especially women and children are affected. We are talking about 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy worldwide. That's nearly half of the global workforce. I mentioned children just now. We tend to just accept that children are part of the global workforce. In fact, the reduction of child labor has significantly slowed down. If we continue like this, we will not by far reach our development goal of eliminating child labor within 5 years. It will take us 40 years, meaning 2 generations of children will be adults by that time. That's too many and is not in line with our common global goal, as set in the Sustainable Development Goals, to eliminate child labor by 2025. So what is the aim of the presidency to address these problems? We have to make sure that the EU does not sit tight, but gives answers to this situation with a coherent strategy embedded in a smart mix of supporting and binding measures. Global supply chains have to be based on the principles of human rights and decent work. This is one of the key issues to be addressed during the German Council presidency. The main pillar here are ambitious Council conclusions on human rights and decent work. There are already international frameworks in place and commitments made that offer a solid foundation for our work. Above all, the UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, to which all EU member states have committed themselves, and the comprehensive work of the ILO that we all adhere to, including the ILO Fundamental Conventions, the 2016 resolution concerning work in global supply chains, and most recently, the ILO Centennial Declaration from 2019. The Commission is promoting decent work in global supply chains in different policy areas. Commissioner Schmidt and his team from DG Employment are in the lead to ensuring, together with other services, the respective EU measures to support a socially just transition of the global economy, in particular in these times of the COVID-19 pandemic. An important example of these measures is the initiative that was already mentioned here, the initiative of Commissioner Reinders for an EU due diligence legislation. What we need now is an EU action plan that adheres to the great values this union was based and founded on. For the Council presidency, the further development of the decent work agenda and the development of binding due diligence rules is the key to this process. We have to move beyond the stalled process of national action plans. And we cannot afford to wait for multinational companies themselves to undertake due diligence on a broader scale. They too need us to make the rules in order to level the playing field and provide legal certainty.
Great.
It is the ambition of the presidency to have its final agreements so in the EPSCO Council in December. So thank you very much for your attention when you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes, and also thank you for bringing in the element of COVID and how that has really led to increased human rights violations, and also bringing in the other elements of social justice that this legislation would also want to address. So now we'll move on to a second round of questions. I want to get us more into the detail of the solutions. We started talking, particularly Johannes has talked about some of the solutions. And Laura, I know you need to leave at 4:45 to go back to the Legal Affairs Committee, so I just wanted to thank you in advance and address this question to you firstly. But just before I move to Lara, I just wanted to remind everyone when they're joining, please put their videos and their microphones on mute so that we can continue the session. So Lara, turning to you. So there are many thorny issues within the concept of corporate due diligence. As rapporteur, what do you consider to be the key elements of a meaningful legislation? And what will you be calling on the Commission to introduce? It'd also be interesting to hear from you how you think environmental defenders should be consulted during this process.
Yeah, maybe I can take both those questions in one go, because indeed I'll have to leave in 10 minutes to talk about exactly this issue actually in the Legal Affairs Committee and about access to justice. And I think your report shows very, very clearly how much those who are literally putting their lives on the front line at the moment for the environment and for others, essentially, how they're left out in the cold. And what we need, therefore, is access to remedy for victims and access to justice. When it comes to business-related harm done. So harm done to the environment, harm done to communities, harm done to victims in third countries. And I think there's two things we need to do specifically from a legal point of view here. We need to ensure the right to remedy, which of course is already acknowledged as a core right or a core building block by the UN and by the OECD. And that's why I introduce in my draft legislation on this grievance mechanisms that could hopefully contribute to effective early stage recourse. But in addition to that, I think what's very, very important here is access to justice in the EU. So access to justice in EU courts for victims in third countries. And to achieve that, I've introduced targeted amendments to EU regulations. And I think those are not the only things, of course, that we need to do. I think we also need to ensure effective liability. We need to make sure that due diligence works as a preventative mechanism that makes as large a group of companies consider as wide a range of risks and impacts possible. But key here, I think, and especially also with regard to environmental defenders, is access to remedy and to justice if there's no access to it in their own countries. And then maybe on the question of environmental defenders more specifically and their role in this as well, I think their role is also very important in the process of building those due diligence processes and programs. And I think they know, like no other, what environmental harm or what harm to indigenous communities or local communities can potentially be done. And so in my report, I've added that they need to be consulted on these due diligence processes that are to be put in place, so that there should be effective and meaningful consultation of them. And I've defined stakeholders. So the stakeholders, the people that need to be involved in creating those due diligence processes very widely. So that would definitely include environmental defenders. I've also specifically mentioned indigenous people. And I've put in some safeguards in that if they're not being consulted, there's the right to request it, of course. And if that doesn't happen, the competent authority can get involved. So I think that essentially the involvement of environmental defenders, local communities and so forth in that due diligence process, not only in designing it, so in telling a company what it needs to be mindful of, what it needs to think about, what it needs to look out for, but also in the implementation of that program. So what is going well, what isn't, what needs to be reviewed is very, very important. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Lara, for joining and good luck in the Legal Affairs Committee. That was really helpful to hear how you're putting it into practice and really relating it to the environmental defenders and their role in ensuring kind of corporates are held to account. So we'll move on to Jefferson to hear from Jefferson again. So we've just heard from key European officials on how they intend to respond to the problems that you outlined earlier in the event. Can you tell us more about your personal experience defending your land? And just a reminder to everyone to go on to the English translation in case you don't speak Portuguese.
Então, é importante mencionar como era antes a comunidade, antes da chegada desse grande empreendimento, né? As famílias viviam bem, elas viviam tranquilas, ou seja, elas produziam seu sustento, tinham acesso aos recursos naturais, como as nascentes, aos peixes, às áreas de lazer, ou seja, tinha toda uma relação comunitária saudável, e a chegada dessa hidrelétrica foi realmente um grande pesadelo para toda essa comunidade, para todas essas famílias que ali foram atingidas. E aí pairou a incerteza sobre o seu futuro, né, dessas famílias, dos seus filhos, né, dos seus próprios vizinhos, de como é que ficaria a vida dessa comunidade, dessas famílias, após a chegada desse empreendimento, né? Então, bateu muito essa incerteza, teve muitas famílias que tiveram muitos problemas de saúde, ansiedade, depressão, começaram a tomar medicamentos, e inicialmente essas empresas, né, esse consórcio, eles fizeram uma promessa de que tudo ficaria bem, que a vida daquelas famílias, daquela comunidade, ia melhorar. Mas os anos foram passando, a construção foi avançando, né? A obra foi avançando, e o que foi se percebendo é que nada disso aconteceu. Assim, o que foi percebido foi uma completa descumprimento daquilo que essa empresa prometia para as comunidades, até os acordos públicos, né, perante o Estado brasileiro, perante a Secretaria de Meio Ambiente. E foi isso que levou a comunidade, as famílias atingidas, a realmente se organizarem e fazerem os protestos, as mobilizações e tudo. Então, foram várias lutas e mobilizações, seja nas avenidas aqui da cidade de Sinop, em frente do Ministério Público Estadual, também federal, e também em frente do escritório da empresa. E o tratamento que essa empresa deu a essas famílias foi o fechamento por completo do diálogo. Ou seja, ela não quis mais dialogar com essas famílias atingidas, né, nem com o movimento, e a partir disso ela moveu um interdito proibitório, né, contra 6 lideranças da comunidade e do movimento também. E, ou seja, essas lideranças e o próprio movimento, ele está proibido de se aproximar, ou seja, está proibido de protestar em frente não só do escritório da empresa, como também das áreas de acesso e do canteiro de obras. Ou seja, isso deixou a comunidade muito apreensiva e com muito medo, e numa indignação muito grande, como se lutar por direito fosse crime, né? E aí existe uma inversão aí dos papéis, onde realmente a comunidade está lutando por direitos e ela é criminalizada. Ou seja, esse processo todo da criminalização a partir das proibições de fazer novos protestos, de novas lutas, e aí a gente está falando de uma violação de um direito constitucional nosso brasileiro. A gente está falando que essas famílias elas não podem fazer uma coisa elementar quando aquilo que, né, a elas não agrada, ou quando tem violação de direito, que é protestar, que é mobilizar. Ou seja, até uma violação da nossa Constituição brasileira, esse processo todo ele evidenciou. E hoje a comunidade vive, de alguma maneira, com certo receio para novas mobilizações, mas isso tem deixado cada vez elas mais indignadas ainda, né, para pensar novas lutas e tudo mais, né? Então, a importância de um processo de diálogo que foi fechado, em vez de cumprir os direitos, que é o que deveria, né, esse empreendedor fazer, ele foi o contrário, ele negou o diálogo e acabou criminalizando essas lideranças, o movimento e essas famílias atingidas.
Thank you so much, Jefferson, for sharing your story and your brave struggles. It's it's so brave of you to join us, and so important that we in Europe hear your story, because you're really kind of on the very much the front line of this fight in the climate crisis. As I mentioned earlier, we've put the allegations that Jefferson and his community have made to the company, and we'll be posting any response from the company on our website. So now moving on to a second view from the German presidency. So Carmen, how do you see these discussions around corporate accountability evolving, and where can member states' experience and work on these areas help in the process of developing an EU-wide legislation?
Thank you very much. Do you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, great,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, for this invitation, and thank you to Jefferson for his powerful testimony and for sharing this with us today. And well, to create a level playing field, we need an EU action plan for responsible business conduct that includes a smart mix of measures and corresponding European legislation. So during our presidency, as Johannes has outlined, we have therefore pushed the agenda for responsible business conduct forward and are currently drafting council conclusions. Therefore, we support the developments in the European Parliament and the Commission's initiative on sustainable corporate governance at EU level, and the public consultation launched just yesterday is an important element of this process, which should be as inclusive as possible, and which also underlines the relevance of today's event. Next to the current German considerations for legislation, many other member states have developed legislation, such as France, or are currently assessing it, Finland, ourselves, and the Netherlands. So in order to advance the discussions on the European level, it is therefore useful to interlink current national discussions and lessons learned with the current European considerations. To give you just a brief outline on what we have done in CODEF, discussions have shown that or underlined that the smart mix approach of voluntary and binding measures should take into account both ecological and social aspects to contribute to improved working and living conditions in global supply and value chains. Furthermore, development cooperation measures and capacity building support for producing countries and companies are key to ensure a just and realistic approach to due diligence implementation to avoid the cut and run phenomenon. In order to support the current consultations of the European Commission on mandatory due diligence, the BMZ will be publishing a perspective paper and host a respective virtual due diligence forum on the question of due diligence regulation in the coming months, so to move this forward. So I think I leave it at that for this first question, and happy to receive more, of course. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carmen, and thank you to you and Johannes and the rest of the German presidency for your leadership on this issue. It's so important. So now we'll move on to some more discussion in terms of what can be done at an EU level. And I'm going to turn back to my colleague Ben. So we've heard from various colleagues and speakers on the event so far about the plans for legislation for corporate accountability. This is obviously something that Global Witness has been campaigning for a while. What, in your opinion, needs to be included in any legislation in order for it to be effective?
Thanks, Rachel. Well, I think the first thing to say is just how delighted I am to be joined by MEP Walters and the German presidency of the Council, because they've been so proactive in taking this issue forward. So the draft report by MEP Walters and the Legal Affairs Committee has brought forward concrete proposals to hold companies to account, and the German presidency has really put this issue firmly on the agenda. And of course, this builds upon the previous Commission studies, which culminated in yesterday's announcement about the consultation, and which showed that for far too long there's been a clear legislative gap, with citizens from Brazil to Belgium struggling to find a legal means with which to hold European companies to account and to find that remedy and justice that MEP Walters mentioned. And as we've also mentioned already, any legislation at the EU level does have the potential to shape corporate behaviour around the world. And that's, I think, why those of us working on this issue are so excited about this moment. So I'd like to outline 5 minimums that we and a number of other civil society organisations feel the legislation must include if it's to effectively prevent the kinds of scenarios that our report exposed and that Jefferson himself has mentioned. So firstly, the new law must apply to all businesses, including finance, of all sizes and sectors acting in the EU. So earlier I mentioned the cases of Berta Cáceres and Jacqueline Romero. Berta was calling out a relatively small project. Jacqueline is protesting against a large one. In Berta's case, the finance came from Europe. In Jacqueline's, the owners are headquartered here. So this legislation needs to uphold the rights of all communities, regardless of the nature of the businesses that they're protesting against. Secondly, businesses must have a duty to address all the adverse human rights, environmental and governance impacts in their global supply chains. So Defending Tomorrow demonstrates the sharpest end of human rights abuses, but additional Global Witness research has shown that EU-based financial institutions are one of the main funding sources of 6 agribusiness companies linked to deforestation in the Amazon and the Congo Basin. We've also exposed allegations of other businesses linked to corruption. So it's clearly not enough to ask businesses to tackle one of these issues, but not the others. Thirdly, we want the legislation to ensure that businesses conduct responsible business conduct, RBC, due diligence to identify, cease, prevent, mitigate, monitor and account for their adverse risks. Fourthly, as we've heard again from MEP Walters, businesses must be made liable for the adverse impacts in their global value chains. And I think if there's one thing that the escalating killings of activists tells us, it's that impunity is the catalyst for future abuses, and accountability is really the only truly effective preventative measure. And fifth and finally, businesses must engage and consult with all relevant stakeholders, including human rights defenders and indigenous peoples, as part of their due diligence. So this last point is fundamental, really. I think land and environmental defenders, as we've heard from Jefferson, are the eyes and ears on the ground. They see the impact of irresponsible business. They know what needs to change. And I think that's why we're urging those responsible for moving this legislation forward to ensure that defenders around the world are able to feed into the processes taking place in Brussels. So I think finally, we would like to welcome, of course, the publication of yesterday's consultation, as well as this morning's remarks from Commissioner Reinders, who clearly stated we need to change corporate behavior in Europe and globally. We need to make companies more sustainable and resilient, as Johannes said, to rebuild from COVID. And we need to have liability so that citizens can hold corporations to account.
Many thanks, Ben, for that really clear message. So I'll turn back to Jefferson. You're joining us from the Amazon, where activists are being threatened every day for standing up for their rights and to defend the precious forests that protect our planet. Where do you and other colleagues need, and how can, what do you and other colleagues need, and how can people in Europe support your struggle?
Então, Rachel, é necessário ter uma pressão internacional maior sobre esses empreendimentos com interesses principalmente das empresas e dos governos europeus aqui no Brasil e principalmente na Amazônia. A gente está falando aqui de energia suja, a gente está falando aqui de energia que polui, a gente está falando de empreendimentos que cometem crimes, e crimes horrendos mesmo. Então, é necessário que exista uma responsabilização muito maior por parte, seja de uma legislação mais rígida, por parte desses empreendedores que têm construído essas grandes obras, principalmente aqui na Amazônia. E para que isso não fique um histórico, um rastro de impunidade, e isso é uma das coisas que a gente tem batalhado muito para que isso não fique no esquecimento, que isso não fique na impunidade, como se o cometer crimes ambientais, violações de direitos, fosse uma coisa que compensasse. Então, é como essa pressão internacional venha de uma maneira mais dura, para que realmente responsabilize essas grandes empresas e os respectivos estados. A comunidade tem pedido muito nesse sentido de como que a vida dela fica da agora para frente, né? Nós temos falado muito que é necessário fazer esses reajustes agora no processo das indenizações da terra, porque foi tão baixo o valor pago para essas famílias, no valor da terra, no valor da casa, das benfeitorias, que elas não conseguiram se reestruturar novamente. Então, é necessário que se corrija minimamente esse valor pago a essas terras para que essas famílias voltem a ter uma mínima estrutura para continuar a sua vida em comunidade. E também é necessário uma série de outras compensações que esse empreendimento deveria ter feito e ele ainda não realizou. Eu destaco um aqui, que é o reflorestamento das áreas de preservação permanente, ou seja, são aqueles 100 metros que a legislação brasileira exige em torno do lago. Então, são quase 2 anos que esse lago encheu, o lago da hidrelétrica Sinop, e até agora o empreendedor não plantou um pé de árvore dentro da comunidade. Então, você imagina o que é ficar com esse lago sem uma proteção, sem uma floresta em redor. Ou seja, assim, a floresta praticamente toda de dentro da comunidade, ela sumiu devido ao lago. E assim, não existe nenhuma iniciativa até então, por parte desse empreendedor, para reconstituir essa área de preservação permanente, ou seja, de minimamente minimizar esse impacto. E assim, nós dizemos que a hidrelétrica Sinop, ela nos traz uma grande lição de como não se deve fazer realmente uma hidrelétrica. É a grande lição. Primeiramente, se a gente pensa no processo da legislação e quando a gente vai dizer assim de maior responsabilização por parte dos governos, por parte das empresas, inclusive transnacionais, é necessário, primeiramente, quando você vai se pensar qualquer obra, seja hidrelétrica, seja mineração, seja qualquer outra, é necessário ter dentro, inclusive garantido da legislação, a consulta prévia, antecipada das comunidades, ou seja, as comunidades têm que ter o direito de serem ouvidas. Elas que estão nesse território há muito tempo, elas que zelaram, inclusive, dessa floresta, elas que têm uma convivência comunitária, é necessário ouvir essas comunidades. Inclusive, essas comunidades têm que ter o direito, inclusive, de dizer não a esses empreendimentos. Ou seja, uma legislação ela tem que passar primeiramente pelas escutas das comunidades. E outro, é necessário ter um plano de recuperação e reestruturação dessas comunidades e das regiões impactadas. Assim. Esses empreendimentos na Amazônia, principalmente as hidrelétricas, tem deixado uma desestruturação por completa das comunidades e dos municípios também. E aí a gente está falando de grandes obras que têm concessões longas, né? No caso da hidrelétrica Sinop, ela tem uma concessão de 35 anos. Ela pode renovar para mais 30 anos. Ou seja, é necessário que se pense um processo de reparação, né, um plano de reestruturação contínuo, né, que dure o tempo que essa hidrelétrica estiver gerando energia. E aí tem que se pensar, primeiramente, nas famílias atingidas, nas comunidades diretamente atingidas e nos municípios diretamente atingidos. E que essa produção de riqueza que está sendo gerada a partir da produção de eletricidade, que parte dela fique localmente, que isso traga realmente qualidade de vida, né, que isso gere renda, que gere empregos, que gere proteção de meio ambiente. Então, é isso que nós do MAB temos discutido, que isso a gente precisa ter uma legislação mais sólida, né, e que realmente imponha aos governos e às próprias empresas para que essas péssimas experiências que nós temos aqui na Amazônia, inclusive essas do telespírito, não voltem a acontecer.
Thanks so much, Jefferson. I think you so eloquently describe how this is not just about human rights purely. This is not just about the environment. This is about the interlock and the interconnected nature between the environment and human rights. And I think it's particularly powerful what you were saying about trees not being replanted. And obviously we know that we need the Amazon to tackle the climate crisis. We need the Amazon to still be strong and take in all the carbon dioxide in order to tackle this climate crisis, and we need those communities who are in the Amazon to protect that forest. And so it's such a powerful testimony, really talking about that interconnectedness. And obviously the EU wants to be a climate leader, and what it now needs to do is tackle the role of its corporations and finance in some of these human rights and environmental abuses. So now moving back to the German presidency, to either to Carmen or to Johannes, whoever would like to answer. So there are many national developments happening on corporate accountability. We've heard about the French law, Dutch developments, Germany, Finland, etc. But now, given that the Commission has yesterday launched a public consultation on how to achieve an EU approach, what does the German presidency see as the key elements that should be included in European legislation? So I open the floor to Carmen or Johannes, or both of you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would just say that we all saw the recent study by the European Commission that indicates that only a minority of businesses in the European Union currently undertakes comprehensive human rights due diligence, which takes into account human and labor rights as well as environmental impacts. So we here within the European Union, we would appreciate if the Commission tabled a proposal for an EU legal framework on sustainable corporate governance, including cross-sector corporate human rights due diligence obligations along global supply chain. This could include a definition of what kind of risk management process companies need to follow to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for its adverse human and labor rights impact. We would also ask the Commission to consider presenting non-binding or indicative guidance in form of quality criteria and minimum standards for national action plans on business and human rights, and building structures for peer learning among member states with regards to their national action plans on business and human rights. And we would ask the Commission and the member states for considering launching EU-wide sector dialogues and scaling up national sectoral approaches on a multi-stakeholder basis to address human and labor rights related issues in global supply and value chains. So this is just a short review from the social questions working party here especially, and I think Carmen would go on with other aspects of this topic.
Yes, I just wanted to compliment that it's really important to to implement the already existing international frameworks that we have. So first and foremost, the UN guiding principles, and that we also need to comprise the whole supply chain in the European legislation, and that also the question of civil liability should be addressed. So those were 3 points I would make. Thanks.
Many thanks, Carmen. So now we're just coming to the last round of questions, and these come from the audience. So we're looking for a kind of quick fire answer from people on this, because we've just got 15 minutes left. So these are questions that have come through through our website when people signed up to the event. So actually, Carmen, I'm going to go back to you first of all. So one of the questions we've had it would be great to hear about examples of or opportunities to hold European companies civilly or criminally liable for harms caused by the subsidiaries or in their supply chains, and what changes are needed to make this easier, to make this civil liability regime easier?
Well, first and foremost, there are already cases pending before European courts against companies to address the question of liability. So I think there is a comprehensive list also on the website of the European Court. And I mean, in general, when it comes to the question of liability, it should clearly be addressed in EU legislation, and also the conditions governing this liability, because it's important to have legal certainty. So that's what I would stress from our point of view, that it needs to be clearly spelled out, the conditions under which liability will be, how liability and the conditions will be governed, and so that we have legal certainty. Yeah. Thanks.
great. Many thanks, Carmen. So moving to you, Jefferson, this is again a question from the audience. So what research or campaigns could help advance this conversation around corporate accountability and support advocates like yourself and policymakers like Johannes, Carmen, and Lara in promoting corporate accountability?
Então, eu acredito que nós temos conversado muito na Amazônia, e eu acredito que a maior campanha que nós podemos pensar é os povos amazônicos querem um basta de grandes projetos na Amazônia. Queremos um basta de hidrelétricas aqui na Amazônia. Os povos indígenas, comunidades ribeirinhas, pescadores, quilombolas, ou seja, basta de hidrelétrica na Amazônia. As nossas experiências de grandes projetos na Amazônia são trágicos, assim. A gente pega as hidrelétricas dos anos 70 para cá, de Tucuruí, passando por Balbina, Giral e Santo Antônio, Belo Monte, hidrelétrica Sinop, hidrelétrica Colíder, São Manuel, Teles Pires, são todas péssimos exemplos e são experiências trágicas, muito trágicas. Então, é um dizer não mesmo a esses grandes projetos. E aí eu volto a dizer que, assim, quem está dizendo isso são os povos amazônicos que realmente sempre cuidaram dessa floresta tão majestosa, tão em voga cada vez mais no debate internacional. De fato, esses povos têm que ser ouvidos. E eles têm afirmado cada vez mais, há décadas e décadas, que esses empreendimentos, esses grandes empreendimentos, eles não trazem nada de benefício, ou seja, eles só destroem a nossa floresta, ou seja, esse patrimônio da humanidade, e a grande campanha seria assim, não queremos mais grandes projetos na Amazônia, esse é a grande campanha que a gente poderia levantar essa bandeira. E quando a gente trata em relação às pesquisas, a gente poderia comprovar isso analisando os grandes impactos que esses projetos têm gerado e têm gestado dentro da floresta amazônica. E é interessante a gente observar esses impactos a partir da constatação dos povos que aqui vivem e que aqui protegeram essa floresta amazônica, ou seja, eles devem ser consultados, eles devem ser ouvidos na hora que forem realmente fazer pesquisas, quais são os impactos, o que isso pode repercutir, gerar, né, para o meio ambiente, para o planeta, como um todo. E essas pesquisas, elas devem ser, a gente fala muito, recortando aqui nas hidrelétricas, elas não devem ser recortadas apenas para uma hidrelétrica, né? Elas têm que ser estudadas e pesquisadas de uma maneira sinérgica, ou seja, elas no seu todo. Não tem como você identificar uns impactos num rio, como o Teles Pires, fazendo pesquisa apenas na hidrelétrica Sinop. Você tem que ver as demais hidrelétricas, né, que estão construídas dentro da cascata do rio, que a gente chama, ou seja, é necessário ter esse olhar muito mais abrangente para o rio, né? Se a gente pegar até o processo da piracema, né, a gente está falando da reprodução dos peixes, tem peixes que navegam mais de 2.000 quilômetros para fazer a sua reprodução. Então, nesse meio, ele vai parar em 4 barramentos. Então, como é que eu posso fazer uma pesquisa olhando só um empreendimento desse? Então, a gente diz muito nesse sentido que é necessário olhar o rio como um todo, né? E aí essas pesquisas, elas têm que vir nesse sentido. E um apoio que as ONGs, os próprios parlamentares, né, os governos europeus, esse apoio às iniciativas que as comunidades têm desenvolvido durante esses anos todos de enfrentamento a esses impactos e essas mudanças todas que esses grandes projetos têm afetado. E existem várias experiências dentro da Amazônia que são interessantes apoiar, incentivar e dar continuidade, seja na produção de alimentos saudáveis, alimentos agroecológicos sem veneno, né, junto com tecnologias de energias realmente limpas, né, seja solar, seja o qual for, mas que isso tem que priorizar a soberania e a autonomia das comunidades. Tem que partir delas, né? Se vir de cima para baixo, de fora para dentro, as perspectivas geralmente não vão dar certo. Então, é necessário fortalecer essas iniciativas, e são várias espalhadas por dentro da Amazônia. E aí, aí a gente começa a tratar os recursos naturais, a gente começa a tratar a água e a energia não como mercadoria. Nós temos que entender que água e energia é um bem vital para a vida. Ela não pode ser tratada como mercadoria, ela não pode ser tratada como especulação, onde poucos grupos, né, poucas empresas ganham. Ou seja, isso tem que ser um bem comum para todos e todas. Nós do MAB afirmamos, né, que água e energia não são mercadoria. A água e energia é um bem vital para a vida, então ele não pode ser precificado como é precificado hoje, né? E nós dizemos mais, nós dizemos que água e energia com soberania, distribuição da riqueza e controle popular. Ou seja, que essa produção de eletricidade, de energia, que isso realmente atenda os interesses do povo brasileiro como um todo, mas principalmente das comunidades atingidas. Mas que esse povo brasileiro, ele tem que definir, ele tem que ter soberania para realmente discutir, debater e dizer se vai construir ou não. Então, é isso um pouco que nós temos conversado enquanto movimento, as organizações da Amazônia, e principalmente as famílias atingidas. E um outro pedido seria uma visita às áreas atingidas, aí pelos parlamentares da União Europeia, pelas embaixadas, e aí eu destaco muito bem aqui a Embaixada da França, que venha localmente conversar com as comunidades atingidas, visite as áreas atingidas, para que isso dê uma repercussão maior, que isso dê mais visibilidade, que a partir disso a gente está no caminho de não cair na impunidade, e que realmente a gente possa fazer diferente. Obrigado.
Thanks so much, Jefferson, and particularly talking about this global movement around the right to say no, which a lot of communities are really pushing for at the moment, in terms of their access to natural resources, as Jefferson was talking about. So we'll just finish with two final questions. One for Johannes. Again, this is an audience question. How do you view the current level of commission for the upcoming legislation to deal with both human rights and environmental impacts? And do you agree that these are inextricably linked, human rights and environment? And what are the views of the Council on this?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, this is really, in the opinion of the presidency, a very cross-cutting subject. And as we have seen also by Jefferson's example here, working conditions and general life circumstances always have an impact on each other. And when you just look at the starting point of many supply chains, when resources like cobalt or rare earths are one, so when you're looking at the production of raw materials, you can almost feel how nature and workers can suffer together. So the German presidency strongly supports the general approach by the Commission and considers this cross-cutting approach by the Commission as an important milestone here. So we are completely supportive of what we know, what is in general coming up here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Johannes. And so our last question I'll give to my colleague Ben. Where do you believe it would be most efficient to create power shifts in order to ensure corporate accountability? And are there any specific actors in the European Union who've played a significant role in preventing change so far?
Thanks, Rachel. I know we're nearly out of time, so I'll address the first half of that question. And in terms of the power shifts, and I think it is important to underline the Commissioner's comments today that this legislation must work to ensure that the companies serve all stakeholders rather than just simply to fill the pockets of directors. And I think that's why, again, it's vital. We've heard from Jefferson, that the communities there feel like they're not being heard. They feel like they're not even being asked the right questions at times about these mega projects that are having such an impact upon their lives and livelihoods. And so I think this is why it's vital companies are obliged to conduct ongoing consultation with all stakeholders, including defenders, communities, and people like Jefferson. Now, this requirement's already an international standard contained in the OECD guidelines, and so it must be reflected in this new law. I mean, effectively, asking and listening is really the only way that companies can make sure that they're aware of the potential risks. So then again, consultation is not enough. Obviously, we know that we need to ensure that stakeholders have a means to access justice via civil liability. And again, there, we fully agree with the Commissioner's comments that this is a necessary tool to ensure that companies can be held to account and that victims are given access to justice. But I guess I would close by saying another power shift that the EU can help with is in shifting power to those defenders like Jefferson, who are on the front lines of the struggle against alleged or proven corporate abuse. So we know the EU has made strong and clear commitments in its guidelines on human rights defenders to support defenders at risk through a broad range of actions, whether that's field visits to trial observation to public or private advocacy. And there are a few places in the world right now, frankly, where land and environmental defenders are in greater need of that diplomatic support than in Brazil, and especially in the Brazilian Amazon. So, Jefferson's just made a cry for help today, effectively, and I hope that MEPs, the EAS, its delegation in Brasilia, the embassies of member states, I hope they can be in touch with Jefferson, be in touch with his allies in organizations like the Comissão Pastoral da Terra, and talk to them about how to put those guidelines into action and ensure that land and environmental defenders are empowered now, whilst also ensuring the EU legislates to hold companies to account in the future.
Many thanks, Ben, and thank you so much to all our fantastic panelists and to the audience for joining today. This really interesting discussion. Also, just a big thank you to all the people behind the scenes who helped make this event happen, particularly Alice, Anna, Amy, Clara, and Sandra for the interpretation. As mentioned earlier, we'll be doing a follow-up blog to answer any of the other questions people have submitted, so do check out our website, globalwitness.org. We also hope that many of you will respond to the European Commission's consultation to make sure your views are heard. Until next time, thanks very much. Goodbye.